Hold that number in your mind. Not a decade, not an era, a single solitary year. 3 expeditions, American, British, French, each sailing independently toward the same frozen edge of the Earth, Antarctica, arriving within months of one another. I accepted that for years. Parallel exploration, the age of discovery. It sounds reasonable on the surface. Then I found it. A single line buried in a footnote of Wilkes's suppressed expedition log. A line his superiors had quietly erased from the published version. 7 words. Formations inconsistent with any natural process known. 7 words. 50 years later, a survivor of the first expedition to overwinter on Antarctica, led by a Norwegian-British explorer named Borchgrevink, gave one interview. 1. He described his crew seeing cities beneath the ice. That section was not translated into English for 60 years. That is when I could no longer look away. Let us begin with what the textbooks allow, what the official record, such as it is, chooses to tell us. Charles Wilkes, American naval officer. He departed in August 1838, commanding a squadron of 6 vessels. He charted over 1,500 miles of Antarctic coastline and returned in 1842. His report, the one he officially filed, was disputed almost immediately. Not disputed for being too bold, disputed for being incomplete. His charts contained features, formations, and his own officers noted stark discrepancies between what the official log recorded and what crew members described in private correspondence recovered by researchers decades later. Wilkes faced court-martial upon his return. Not once, multiple times. He was accused of illegal punishment of crew, of conduct unbecoming an officer, acquitted on most charges, but he spent the following decades buried in bureaucratic obscurity, his Antarctic findings overshadowed, his personal journals heavily edited before publication. A man who sailed to the edge of the unknown and was systematically buried. Dumont d'Urville departed Toulon in September 1837. His mission was to push further south than any French vessel had gone before, to claim territory, to advance science, to plant the tricolor in the ice. He returned in November 1840. He published his accounts. Adélie Land, named for his wife, was charted. He is remembered. He is celebrated. In May 1842, he boarded a train at Versailles with his wife and son. The train derailed. The fire that followed was catastrophic. D'Urville, his wife, his son, did not survive. Much of the material he had been traveling with, including expedition documents reportedly being transported for review, gone. Not lost at sea, not destroyed in a naval warehouse, gone on a train in France 2 years after his return from Antarctica. I am not saying that means anything. Train accidents happen. Tragedy is not conspiracy. But hold that detail, just hold it. And then there was James Clark Ross, the most decorated of the 3. He reached what would be named the Ross Ice Shelf, a wall of ice the height of the White Cliffs of Dover, stretching for hundreds of miles. He described it as impenetrable, as staggering, as something that stopped him absolutely. His published accounts are considered models of Victorian scientific restraint, precise, methodical, dispassionate. And yet his crew logs, the raw ones filed with the Admiralty, the ones that took researchers decades to fully access, contain passages that appear nowhere in the official narrative. References to what one officer described only as geometric anomalies in the exposed rock faces. References in at least 2 independent crew journals to what sounds unmistakably like structured stone. Not ice. Stone. Not shaped by weather. Shaped. Follow the thread further. Once you begin, it becomes genuinely difficult to stop. You arrive at Carsten Borchgrevink, Norwegian-British explorer. He was part of a whaling expedition in 1895 that became, by most accounts, the first group of human beings to actually land on the Antarctic continent, not charting from offshore, not approaching and retreating, landing, standing on it, walking. He returned in 1898 with the Southern Cross Expedition and spent the winter of 1899 on the continent itself, the first humans to deliberately overwinter in Antarctica. What did he find? This is where the official record does something I have come to recognize with cold clarity. It narrows. It becomes extraordinarily specific about certain things: the cold, the isolation, the biological samples, the meteorological measurements, and breathtakingly vague, almost deliberately vague, about everything else. One of his crew, a zoologist named Nikolai Hansen, died during the expedition. The official cause, a digestive condition. He was 29 years old. He was buried on a ridge overlooking the bay. His death receives one paragraph in most historical accounts. Another crew member returned and spent the rest of his life refusing to speak publicly about what he had experienced. He gave one interview to a Norwegian newspaper in 1903. The relevant section was not translated into English for nearly 60 years. When it finally was, it described crew members experiencing what the interviewer carefully called episodes of geographic fixation. Men who became utterly convinced they could see something beneath the ice, something organized, something that should not be there. The deeper you go into Borchgrevink's own private writings, the more a pattern emerges. He is precise about logistics, meticulous about wildlife. But when he reaches for words to describe the interior geology, what the rock looked like where the wind had scoured the ice completely away, he becomes abstract, almost poetic, almost evasive. He never finishes those sentences, not once. In at least 3 known passages from his private correspondence, the sentence describing the rock formations is either cut short, transitions abruptly to a different subject, or exists in a version that differs markedly from the one filed with his expedition sponsors. The same absence, every single time. Let us speak about what the physical record actually suggests. Antarctica is not uniformly buried beneath ice. There are exposed rock regions, nunataks, where geology is accessible, where you can examine the ancient surface of the continent, where under the right conditions you can see what lies beneath the ice sheet at the margins. Early expedition members described, repeatedly across decades, formations in these exposed zones that struck them as deeply anomalous. The language varies: peculiar regularity, unusual right-angle faces, stone arrangements, unlike any natural weathering pattern. But the theme repeats with unsettling precision across multiple independent accounts from multiple expeditions spanning several decades. Regular angles, repeated geometric intervals. Stone that, in the words of one crew member whose journal was published privately by his family in 1931 and has never been incorporated into mainstream historical literature, did not break the way stone breaks. Geologists will offer explanations: columnar basalt, frost wedging, differential erosion, the natural tendency of certain volcanic rock to cleave in angular patterns. I have read those explanations. They account for a great deal of what early explorers found disorienting in an environment unlike anything they had ever seen. But here is where the orthodox explanation collapses. It is not the angles. It is the distribution. Multiple crew members from multiple expeditions, men who had never met, citizens of actively competing nations with no mechanism for coordinating their accounts, described strikingly similar formations in different geographic locations along the Antarctic coast. Not the same location, different locations, separated by hundreds of miles. If this is natural geology, columnar basalt, frost fracture, erosion, that is interesting but unremarkable. Antarctic geology is relatively uniform in places. Fine. But overlay the approximate locations described in these independent accounts, and a pattern emerges that does not map onto any known geological formation. The descriptions cluster in ways that suggest, and I want to hold carefully to that word, distribution, intentional placement, spacing, not a quarry, not a single building. Something incomprehensibly larger. Something that would require you to step back very far to perceive as a whole. And here is where this becomes impossible to dismiss. For the official history to hold, for the natural geology plus overexcited explorers' explanation to account for everything we find in these records, you need to explain one thing. Why did 3 separate governments, in the same decade with no coordinated communication, all choose to heavily redact, delay, dispute, or simply never fully publish the raw reports from their Antarctic expeditions? The United States did not publish Wilkes's complete charts for years. Some were reclassified. The British Admiralty received Ross's full logs, and a substantial portion of what his officers separately filed was not publicly catalogued until the 20th century. France published D'Urville's account, but that account has been noted by at least 2 French historians as diverging from surviving crew diaries in specific recurring ways. Always the same kinds of divergence: the geological observations, the descriptions of the coastline's interior features, the character of what the exposed rock looked like, not the temperature readings, not the biological specimens, not the navigational data, the rocks. Why the rocks? Here, I must be honest about the boundary between what I can demonstrate and what I can only gesture toward. There exists a body of research, not fringe material, not anonymous speculation, but the documented work of architectural historians, geographers, and scholars of cartographic anomalies, quietly building a case for the existence of a prior world-spanning civilization, one whose reach was vastly broader, and whose erasure vastly more deliberate than mainstream history will acknowledge. You have encountered fragments of this: the Piri Reis map, the Orontius Phineas map, maps that appear to depict Antarctic coastlines with a specificity that should have been impossible, coastlines matching subglacial topography confirmed only by 20th century sonar, coastlines depicted without the ice that now buries them. How? The standard answer, that these maps were copied from older sources, compiled from explorers whose records are now lost, is itself an admission. It admits that cartographic knowledge of Antarctica existed before any expedition we recognize as first contact. It admits that someone had been there, had mapped it, had left records detailed enough that European cartographers in the 16th century could reproduce them with recognizable accuracy. It simply declines to ask who. And here is where the thread from 1840 connects to something much larger. If there existed, at some point prior to recorded history, or prior to the history we are permitted to access, a civilization capable of worldwide presence, of construction in extreme environments, of leaving traces in the rock visible to 19th century naval officers through centuries of ice and weathering, then the question is not whether Antarctica was inhabited. The question is when it stopped. And the question after that, the one that should stay with you, is why the record of that habitation was so thoroughly, so consistently erased on a worldwide scale. Not suppressed in one country, not buried by one government, erased across languages, across archives, across the official histories of nations that spent centuries in bitter competition with each other and yet arrived at the same silence on this single subject. That uniformity of silence is itself evidence, the most devastating kind. I want to return to the human element for a moment, because this is not merely an archival mystery. It is a story about what these expeditions did to the men on them. The rate of psychological collapse among early Antarctic expedition crews is not widely discussed in mainstream historical literature, but it is documented. Multiple crew members from the Wilkes expedition were described in ship records as suffering from what the surgeons of the day called polar madness, a broad diagnosis covering everything from simple cabin fever to episodes of acute hallucinatory crisis. Some of these men described visions, cities, architecture in the ice. I know the rational responses: isolation, hypoxia, the psychological devastation of extreme environment, the fata morgana, The mirage effect that polar explorers are well documented to have experienced, in which distant ice can appear to take on the shapes of towers, walls, buildings against the sky. All of that is real. All of it is documented. I am not dismissing it. But here is what I keep returning to. The visions these crew members reported were not random. They were not generic European cityscapes transposed onto ice, not familiar castles conjured by homesick minds. The architectural descriptions that survived, in private letters, in unpublished journals, in the one or two accounts that made it into print before being quietly discontinued, have a specific, haunting character. Massive scale, non-European proportion, stone rather than timber or brick. Layout suggesting not individual buildings but planned arrangements, districts, grids. And they described it as buried, visible only in fragments, as if whatever they were perceiving, through mirage or madness or something else entirely, was the exposed corner of something incomprehensibly larger still concealed beneath the ice. One officer, and I will not name him because his family remains identifiable, wrote in a private letter to his brother that he had seen from the ship's deck a sequence of walls extending along the cliff face for a distance he could not estimate, bearing no resemblance to any formation he could attribute to nature or weather. He wrote that he reported it to his commanding officer. He wrote that he was told to strike it from his personal log. He wrote that he did not strike it from the letter. That letter was donated to a regional archive by his descendants in 1974. It has been cited in exactly one academic paper. That paper was never republished after its initial appearance in a specialist journal that folded 2 years later. One letter, one citation, then silence. This is how the record disappears. Not in a single dramatic act of destruction, but slowly, quietly, entry by entry, journal by journal, until the silence becomes so total it no longer needs to be enforced. What strikes me, the longer I sit with this material, is not any single anomaly. Any one of these could be explained away. Any individual discrepancy, any single redaction, any one explorer's breakdown or unexplained death or cryptic letter taken alone. Each of these is manageable. Historical noise. It is the pattern, not the geology alone, not the simultaneous expeditions alone, not the suppressed reports alone, not the deaths alone, not the raving crew members alone, not the pre-glacial maps alone. All of it together, pointing in the same direction across a century of Antarctic engagement, across governments that despised each other, across languages and archives and institutional interests that had every reason to compete and no conceivable reason to cooperate, and yet converging again and again on a single uniform absence. The question is not who made the decision. Perhaps no single person did. Perhaps the decision made itself. The way certain truths, when they are large enough and disruptive enough, generate their own gravity toward erasure. Not conspiracy in the cinematic sense. Something slower, something more diffuse. Something that operates through the ordinary human instinct to protect the version of history that allows everything else to continue functioning. That allows the world to hold its shape. That allows people to sleep without understanding what has been taken from them. Because if what these expedition members saw was real, if the formations were architectural, if the scale was what the descriptions suggest, if the geographic distribution maps onto something intentional, something built, then the implications do not stop at Antarctica. They ripple backward through everything, every accepted timeline, every assumption about the age and origin and reach of human civilization, every map, every founding myth of every nation that sent ships to that ice, every story we have ever told ourselves about where we came from and how long we have been here. Once you allow that possibility in, even lightly, even as a provisional question, once you see the shape of what the evidence suggests, you begin to understand why the silence is so total, so coordinated, and so terrifyingly old. 3 expeditions, 1 silence, What did they find on that coastline that required three competing nations to independently arrive at the same omission? What did the rock look like in those scoured margins where the wind had pulled the ice away that made experienced naval officers reach for language they could not complete? Why do the pre-colonial maps know what they should not know? Why do the men who saw it most closely come back changed, some broken, some silent, some dead, before they could be properly questioned? What is the relationship between those geometric distributions and the ones researchers have been quietly documenting in dozens of other locations across the Earth? The architectural uniformities, the impossible coordination, the civilization-scale evidence that appears wherever someone looks carefully enough and is willing to write down what they actually see rather than what they have been told to see. I do not know. I genuinely do not know. And I want to be careful not to claim more than the evidence supports. But I know what the evidence suggests. I know what it feels like to read these accounts in sequence, to watch the same absence repeat itself across decades, across languages, across the institutional memories of governments that should have no reason to agree on anything. It feels like a door that someone very carefully closed. And somewhere on the other side of it, under ice that has been thickening for centuries, over stone that may or may not have been shaped by hands we have no name for, the answer is still there, waiting